He thought it was all just theatre. Scarlet coats, tall hats, cold stares and polished boots. J.D. Vance walked through Horse Guards Parade like it was a museum exhibit, mocking the uniforms, laughing at the stillness, calling Britain's soldiers ceremonial mascots. Prince William stayed diplomatic, silent, respectful, because that's what the moment demanded. No headlines, no incident, no fire to feed, and everything might have stayed that way until the end. When J.D. Vance reached out to shake a royal guard's hand, and the guard didn't move, didn't blink, didn't accept it. But when he finally broke formation, he didn't just refuse a handshake. He answered every insult Vance had thrown that day, with 10 words that silenced the courtyard, and a silence that echoed across the world. Now, before we show you the moment Prince William gave him permission to speak, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, hit that subscribe button with the bell icon, and stay locked in. Because some men don't raise their voices, they raise the standard. The courtyard at Horse Guards Parade caught the spring light the way old stone always does, sharp and cold, throwing shadows older than memory. Tourists pulled jackets tighter, while pigeons shuffled along gravel rims. Beyond the black security ropes, cameras positioned for angles. The Union Jack stirred above the barracks. Inside the secured perimeter, the air hummed with ceremonial tension. Sergeant Tristan Merrick had been standing since 8 that morning. 22 years in the Coldstream Guards had taught him how to hold position until holding became breathing. 2 tours in Helmand, not a single reprimand. The creases in his tunic were as precise as the memory of men who'd worn the same uniform and hadn't come home. He wasn't there for photographs. His job was simple: stand perfectly still until not standing was required. He saw the motorcade before he heard it. The black Range Rover, with the British standard, rolled in first. Then a second vehicle, sleeker, American plated. It pulled into place like a guest who expected the room to adjust around him. Senator J.D. Vance stepped out with the posture of a man who knew cameras were watching. Tall, navy suit pressed sharp, sunglasses that stayed on too long. The American flag pin on his lapel caught the light. He adjusted his cufflinks, swept his gaze across the scarlet formation, and exhaled through his nose. "Well," he said, not quietly enough, "impressive uniforms must be exhausting standing so still for nothing." Prince William stood just to his left, hands folded behind his back, expression as neutral as centuries of royal training could make it. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, his voice came measured, almost gentle. "Tradition, Senator, sometimes carries weight no budget can measure." Vance's mouth curved into something between a grin and a smirk. "And here I thought you measured everything by the pound." Polite laughter flickered from one aide, then died halfway when no one else joined. The rest of the entourage shifted like passengers on a train that had just hit unexpected turbulence. Merrick stood third from the left, bayonet aligned, boots mirror bright, gaze fixed beyond the courtyard. He heard every word. His posture didn't shift, but his mind filed the remark. He'd heard worse in war zones, but there was something about this new disrespect, delivered from polished shoes and diplomatic immunity, that settled differently, heavier. The entourage began moving toward the inspection line, camera shutters clicking in rhythmic bursts. Merrick remained motionless. From the corner of his eye, he caught Prince William's hand adjusting his cuff, a gesture so subtle it might have been nothing. But to those who knew the language of royal signals, it was everything. Maintain formation. Not yet. Vance's footsteps crunched across gravel with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to hold ground under fire. He moved toward the line of guards, steps just a fraction too relaxed for the setting. Merrick didn't shift, didn't speak. But behind his eyes, something began to steady. Not anger, not pride. Something older. The slow, cold accumulation of readiness that comes from knowing exactly when to do nothing and when to do everything. He was no stranger to insult. But this time the insult was wearing his uniform, and the uniform had a long memory. The inspection moved with choreographed precision, slow, deliberate, framed for cameras. But tension threaded through every step. Prince William walked just ahead of Senator Vance, flanked by aides and foreign affairs officers. Their route curved past the line of Coldstream guards, motionless as carved stone. Every 15 seconds, shutters clicked from the press gallery. Vance kept his hands clasped behind his back, mimicking military bearing without the weight. His gaze wandered. He leaned toward one of the officials without lowering his voice. "All this for a photo op? I thought we were here for a security briefing, not a West End show." The aide offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is tradition, Senator." Vance scoffed, the sound sharp enough to carry. Taxpayers funding pageantry instead of protection. How very 18th century. Sergeant Tristan Merrick heard it. So did the others. Not a muscle moved in the scarlet line, but to anyone trained to read soldiers, there was a ripple, subtle as wind across water. One of the younger guards at the far end tightened his fingers against the grip of his SA-80 rifle, knuckles going briefly white. Merrick's voice came low, steady, barely audible. "Easy." The guard's hand relaxed. The moment passed. The line held. Prince William gestured toward the building's facade. "The architecture predates Waterloo. These grounds have hosted 10 sovereigns, 13 prime ministers, and more wartime planning than most museums could catalogue." Vance raised an eyebrow, the expression carrying just enough skepticism to insult without quite crossing into open disrespect. "Pretty setting for defence policy, but I've always believed a country's strength shows in combat, not costume." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, visible, drifting, impossible to ignore. Merrick's jaw tightened, then relaxed, with practiced control. His training ran deeper than politics or pride. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. He'd once stood watch in Lashkar Gah, while mortars fell close enough to taste the dust. Silence was armour. Behind them, a military attaché tried to steer the conversation back towards safer ground. "Perhaps we should head toward the MOD wing for the classified briefing." But Vance had already drifted sideways, pausing beside one of the royal guards. He gave the soldier a theatrical once-over, head tilting like he was examining a museum exhibit. "These lads even allowed to talk, or do they just freeze for tourists?" No reply. The guard didn't move. That was the answer, and somehow that made it worse. Vance grinned, stepping back beside William with the satisfied air of someone who'd just proven a point. "Guess I got my answer. Ceremonial mascots." William's expression didn't change, but his voice came quieter, edged with something that wasn't quite warning, but wasn't far from it. "They're guardsmen, Senator, not mascots, and they've bled in places most people can't find on a map." Merrick caught the line, held it in his chest like breath before a dive. Not yet, but it was building. As the group approached the reception building, aides quickened their pace. Press were ushered back toward the perimeter. Cameras turned away, capturing only the broad strokes of departure. But the insults hadn't left. They stayed behind, filed in the minds of men who'd been trained not to forget, like names carved into stone. Waiting. The luncheon was held in one of the smaller reception rooms inside the Ministry of Defence Annex, modest by royal standards, but steeped in understated grandeur. Low ceilings, wood-panelled walls, and polished silver that had probably been used to sign treaties before most attendees were born. The palace called it diplomatic civility. The guest list was tight. 5 from the UK, 3 from the US, plus senior aides and 1 wire reporter positioned discreetly. No cameras, just enough press to document that it happened. The table stretched with meticulous precision. Seating charts, engraved place cards, wine poured exactly below the rim. Sergeant Tristan Merrick stood behind Prince William's chair, 1 pace to the right, hands clasped behind his back. To anyone unfamiliar with protocol, he might as well have been wallpaper, but his presence was intentional. always within earshot, always listening. The room hummed with polite conversation over starter plates, trade policy, naval exercises, the kind of diplomatic small talk designed to fill space without saying anything that might end up quoted. Then J.D. Vance lifted his wine glass and tapped it lightly with the edge of his ring. The sound cut through the murmur like a knife through linen. "To new partnerships," he said, raising the glass higher, "and to never letting history get in the way of strategy." There was polite laughter, a few nods. The prince lifted his glass without a word, the gesture so neutral it could have meant anything. But Vance wasn't finished. He gestured loosely toward the door, where Merrick and the other guardsmen had been stationed earlier. "And maybe one day," he continued, voice carrying that particular American confidence that sounds like optimism but lands like condescension, "we can all agree that defense budgets are better spent on missiles than on pageantry. Red coats look good on postcards, but they don't stop tanks." Silence. A single fork clinked against a plate somewhere down the table. Someone cleared their throat. No one spoke. Prince William set his glass down with deliberate care. "Tradition isn't expense, Senator," he said, his tone calm but carrying the kind of quiet steel that doesn't need volume. "It's investment in continuity. These institutions don't just honor the past, they protect the dignity of the present." Vance shrugged, reaching for his bread like the conversation had already bored him. "Continuity doesn't win wars, and dignity's a luxury when bullets are flying." From his post behind the prince's chair, Merrick said nothing, but he heard every word. His hands didn't twitch. His breathing didn't change. But in his mind, something filed itself away. Not anger, not reaction, just memory. The way you remember the exact shape of a helmet in a tent that collapsed under mortar fire, or the sound a friend makes when they exhale for the last time. He'd stood with real soldiers, buried some, carried others, and the uniform on his back? It had never once asked to be defended, only to be worn with silence that meant something. At the head of the table, Prince William's gaze flickered briefly toward Merrick. Not a nod, not a signal, just the faintest acknowledgement. Steady. Merrick blinked once, slowly. The air returned to something resembling normal. Laughter resumed 2 chairs down. An aide redirected the conversation toward climate initiatives and joint naval maneuvers. But under the table, one aide's fingers tapped nervously on a tablet screen. The microphone of the lone journalist had stayed on the entire time. Every word had been recorded. And while Vance went back to sipping French wine over British lamb, Merrick remained motionless, steel carved into flesh, holding ground that wasn't physical but mattered more than most battlefields. Because there are things a soldier doesn't answer in the moment. He waits. He remembers. And then, when duty allows, he answers properly. The clink of cutlery faded behind heavy doors as staff began clearing the reception suite. Afternoon light angled through tall windows in the corridor outside, warming pale stone and catching the gold trim of ceremonial frames. Sergeant Tristan Merrick stood just outside the room now, dismissed from direct guard duty but still posted for exit detail. His role had shifted into something more invisible, no longer protecting a prince, just observing a hallway. Across the corridor, a young palace aide struggled with a brass stand, holding both the Union Jack and the American flag. The base wobbled. Merrick stepped forward without a word, one gloved hand steadying the pole before it tipped. "Thank you, sir," the aide whispered, flustered. "Didn't think those things were so bloody heavy." Merrick adjusted the base with the kind of care that suggested he'd done this before. "They're not," he said quietly. "You just have to carry them like they matter." He stepped back into position. Footsteps approached, Vance's voice arriving before his silhouette, echoing down the stone corridor with the kind of volume that suggested he didn't care who was listening. "And that's what I told the journalist. If Britain wants to play with the big boys, it can't afford to keep pouring money into marching bands and velvet chairs." The senator rounded the corner, flanked by 2 aides and a foreign policy attaché, whose expression suggested he'd heard this speech several times already. Vance's tone had shifted from diplomatic to dismissive, the kind of candour that emerges when people think the performance is over. They're soldiers in name, but it's theatre, nothing more. That red coat doesn't make them warriors, it makes them actors. Merrick didn't look up, but he heard it. Every word. The hallway wasn't crowded, just hushed, mid-afternoon quiet. Everything echoed more than it should. One of the aides caught sight of Merrick and quickly looked away. The attaché tried to soften things. "Senator, we do find value in ceremonial presentation. The British public likes costumes," Vance interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "Sure, but let's not confuse uniforms with war fighters. Standing still doesn't win battles." The group disappeared into the stairwell beyond, voices fading into the building's stone throat. Merrick's gaze didn't follow, but his mind did. He could still see the blast wall in Helmand, where he'd lost Corporal Ethan Dawes, 23 years old, from Leicester, used to whistle during perimeter checks. Dawes had stood in this same uniform, had held the same ceremonial rifle at Windsor just 6 months before deployment, had come back in a flag-draped box, that uniform folded over his chest. "Costume theatre," the senator had said. Merrick's jaw flexed once, then relaxed. He recited his oath in silence, the way some people recite prayers. Serve the crown. Defend without pride. Remember without voice. The door to the reception suite creaked open. Prince William emerged with a senior aide, exchanging clipped final words about scheduling and press releases. He passed Merrick, pausing just long enough for a glance and a half nod. Not acknowledgement, permission. Merrick gave a shallow bow. Nothing more. Outside in the courtyard, the motorcade was already warming up, engines rumbling low, exhaust curling in the afternoon air. A row of photographers began repositioning for the farewell shot, adjusting lenses and checking light meters. The final act was approaching. Everyone could feel it. But what no one saw, what only Merrick knew, was that the curtain wouldn't fall with applause. It would fall in silence, exactly where it belonged. The motorcade waited at the foot of the grand steps. Black cars, polished to mirror finishes, flanked by uniformed drivers and discreet security detail. Above them, the Union Jack fluttered in the breeze. Cameras had returned, not a full press corps, just a vetted handful allowed to capture the closing moments. Their lenses trained on the carpeted path where the delegation would descend for requisite farewells. Prince William stood at the top of the stairs, posture upright, hands loosely clasped behind his back. J.D. Vance was beside him, adjusting his jacket sleeves and speaking to someone off camera in a voice that still carried that particular smugness, the kind that comes from believing you've won something without realizing the game hasn't ended. The tension from earlier had thinned into the atmosphere, but hadn't left. It simply waited, coiled. At the bottom of the stairs, the Royal Guard stood in formation once more, 6 men in full ceremonial attire, perfectly spaced, motionless as monuments. Sergeant Tristan Merrick was at the far right of the line, positioned closest to the senator's exit path. He hadn't been scheduled to return to this position, but Prince William had made a quiet adjustment, one known only to 2 people, and understood by both. The moment came with a quiet instruction from the prince, delivered in a tone so low it could have been mistaken for breath. "Sergeant Merrick," he said, drawing no attention from anyone else, "you may stand at ease for the farewell. It wasn't protocol, but it wasn't disallowed either. It was a choice, one that left just enough room for discretion, enough room to be human, if Merrick chose to be." But Merrick did not move. He remained at attention. As Vance descended the steps, camera shutters began their staccato rhythm. William followed at a measured pace, offering farewell nods, pausing briefly for a photo that would appear in tomorrow's papers. Then came the handshake line. Vance moved down it with robotic efficiency, gripping hands he didn't know, nodding at uniforms he didn't understand. "Great meeting you. Strong presence here. Appreciate the tour." Then he reached Merrick. He extended his hand casually, as if expecting the motion to be met halfway. "Fine show, Sergeant. Hope they pay you extra for standing so still." For a heartbeat, the courtyard held its breath. Merrick didn't move. His eyes stared past Vance, fixed on something eternal and unwitnessed. The senator's hand lingered in the air. A murmur stirred among the onlookers. One reporter leaned in slightly, sensing something shift. A camera clicked without flash, capturing the moment before anyone understood what it meant. Prince William, 2 paces away, watched in stillness. His expression gave nothing away. Vance withdrew his hand slowly, the easy confidence in his posture flickering like a candle in wind. His smirk faded into something less certain. "That's the problem," he muttered, just loud enough to carry. "All form, no respect." The line moved forward. Aides shuffled. Security detail tensed without knowing why. But the atmosphere did not move. It stayed exactly where Merrick had left it, suspended, waiting. Because it was in that refusal, quiet, disciplined, motionless, that the day began to turn. The silence that followed J.D. Vance's muttered insult wasn't empty. It had weight, dense and electric. Vance had already turned half away, brushing at his suit cuff like the handshake meant nothing. But something in Merrick's stance stopped him. Not movement, Merrick still hadn't flinched, but unmistakable resistance, the kind that isn't physical, the kind that speaks louder than shouting ever could. Vance paused mid-step. "What?" he said, voice rising slightly. "Not allowed to shake hands? Against palace rules?" That's when Sergeant Tristan Merrick finally broke formation. He didn't salute, didn't shout. He simply turned his head, just enough to meet the senator's gaze. It was the first deliberate movement he'd made in over an hour, and it cracked the air like a rifle bolt sliding home. The entire courtyard went still. Prince William's posture shifted subtly, shoulders tensed, lips parted as if to intercept, but he said nothing. He waited. Merrick's voice came low, even, and unshaken. Every word carved from stone. "No. Respect isn't earned by noise, sir. It's kept by silence until it's tested." You could have heard a pin drop in that courtyard. Every aide, every guard, every photographer froze mid-motion. The words weren't loud, but they travelled like sound across water. Something in the way he said them made it feel like they'd been waiting all morning to be spoken. Vance blinked, genuinely caught off guard. "Excuse me." Merrick turned his body now, not much, just enough to shift from fixture to presence. Still upright, still in uniform, but no longer part of the scenery. "You mock the uniform, Senator. Call it theatre. Call us mascots." His tone never rose, never wavered. "But British soldiers don't perform. They remember. These uniforms carry names inside the seams, stitched into fabric by hands that never came home, names you wouldn't recognize, sacrifices you wouldn't understand." Vance's face tightened, colour rising slightly. "No offence meant." Merrick's reply came instantly, without hesitation. Then, "None taken, only corrected." Gasps stirred behind the press barrier. A second camera shutter snapped. Quiet, almost reverent, like someone documenting a moment they knew would matter later. The senator looked around, suddenly aware of the space opening around him. The distance between him and the guard, between him and the legacy he'd tried to belittle without understanding what it cost. Prince William stepped forward half a pace. For a moment, it seemed he might intervene, might step between them to smooth things over, to restore diplomatic calm, but instead he simply gave the smallest nod, a royal acknowledgement. Not just of what Merrick had said, but that he had the right to say it when no one else could. Vance exhaled sharply through his nose, forced what was left of his smirk, and turned to descend the final step into the waiting motorcade. No more words. No parting shots. The convoy doors closed with the soft finality of sealed judgment. Tires crunched over gravel. Flags fluttered behind tinted windows. The engines pulled away, carrying the senator toward Heathrow, and whatever headlines would follow. Merrick returned to attention as if nothing had happened. The moment passed, but what had been said would not unsay itself, because protocol could be followed, tradition could be honoured, but sometimes the truth had to break silence, to protect the dignity the uniform had never asked to be given, only to be remembered. The sun had dipped low by the time the debriefing at Kensington Palace began. Long glass windows in the West Conference Room caught the last amber light of the day, throwing it across polished floors and the edge of a dark oak table, where protocol officers and senior aides had gathered in the kind of quiet tension that follows moments no one quite knows how to classify yet. Prince William sat at the head, not slouched, but no longer ceremonial. His tie had been loosened slightly. A single folder lay closed before him, untouched. One of his senior aides, a man far more comfortable behind spreadsheets than statements, spoke first, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trying not to make things worse. The US delegation's already en route to Heathrow, no press release expected from their side, a few murmurs from the BBC, but we don't anticipate it spiralling beyond a news cycle. Another advisor added, tone cautious. There was a mic open during the luncheon. Some of the senators' remarks may leak, regardless of what we do. William didn't look up. His voice came quiet, final. Let them. A pause. Everyone at the table waited for him to continue, but he didn't immediately. After a long moment, he spoke again. He wasn't wrong about the budget, but he was wrong about what it buys. The table remained silent, waiting. He looked at the aide across from him. Has there been any internal action taken against Sergeant Merrick? No, sir. Standard reviews were bypassed at your discretion. Good. He reached for the folder, opened it with deliberate care, and signed the document inside with a single stroke that seemed to close something rather than open it. Enter commendation under exemplary conduct, ceremonial integrity. Keep it quiet. No ceremony, no press, just on record. He stood, pushing back the chair. The room rose with him. The guard doesn't speak often, he said, as he walked toward the doors, not looking back. But when it does, it speaks for those who can't. The door closed behind him with the soft finality of a chapter ending. In the barracks wing across London, Sergeant Tristan Merrick sat on the edge of his bunk, polishing his boots in the dim light of evening. The room was quiet. Distant sounds echoed down the corridor, lockers closing, water running, boots crossing tile, in the steady rhythm of men preparing for sleep or standing watch. But Merrick moved like a man outside of time, focused, steady, the way he'd been trained. He finished the first boot, set it aside, and began on the second. Applied wax without looking up, the motion automatic, meditative. The door creaked. A fellow guardsman leaned in, half a grin on his face. You really didn't shake his hand? Merrick didn't stop polishing. No. Why not? He paused, just long enough for it to land properly, because he never offered one that honoured what it should. The younger man gave a quiet nod, more reverent than amused. He didn't ask anything else, just backed out of the doorway, leaving Merrick to his routine. Lights dimmed, footsteps faded. The barracks settled into the kind of silence that comes at the end of long days when no one has energy left for conversation. Merrick set the boots beside his locker, aligned them perfectly. He unbuckled his tunic, folded it with the practiced care of someone who'd done this thousands of times, and set it on the bench like it was something sacred. Because it was, not because of fabric, or buttons, or thread, but because of what it had stood for today, and what it had refused to bow to. The next morning, London moved on the way cities do, oblivious, efficient, already focused on the next headline. The footage of J.D. Vance's visit played in sanitized loops on the morning news programs. Handshakes, smiles, flags waving in slow motion. The sound was muted, the uncomfortable parts edited out. The silence stayed buried beneath diplomacy. At Horse Guards Parade, the ceremony reset itself, as it always did. By mid-morning, tourists lined the black railings again, smartphones raised like periscopes. children perched on shoulders, visitors whispering guesses about who was who, which regiment wore what colours, whether the guards ever blinked. It was pageantry again, surface level and safe. But the guard who took his place at the far right of the line, beneath the shadow of the marble arch, he wasn't just anyone. Sergeant Tristan Merrick stood still, eyes forward, posture rigid. The same as yesterday, the same as always. He didn't scan the crowd, didn't acknowledge the chatter or the cameras, but from somewhere near the front, an elderly man in a weathered tweed coat raised his hand slowly and gave a quiet salute. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his beret old and sun-faded, the kind worn by men who'd earned the right decades ago. Merrick saw it. A beat passed. He didn't break formation, protocol wouldn't allow that, but his gaze shifted, just barely, just enough, acknowledged. From inside his radio earpiece, a voice hummed through low static, US media picking it up. One quote making rounds. Respect isn't earned by noise. Attributed to an unnamed royal guard. No response required. Merrick didn't move. A light breeze swept across the square, catching the corner of a Union Jack beside the War Memorial. The wind shifted again, cooler now. Still, Merrick didn't move. But behind his silence, his thoughts were clear. Tradition doesn't shout. It doesn't defend itself on talk shows. It doesn't trend. It waits. It watches. It holds the line for those who no longer can. And when tested, it answers. Not with noise, but with stillness that speaks louder than any speech ever could. The changing of the guard commenced right on time. The brass began to play. Boots struck stone in perfect rhythm. The tourists clapped. The cameras captured it all. The moment had passed, and yet it hadn't. Not really. Because the uniform hadn't changed, and neither had the man inside it. Now let me ask you something. What would you have done in Sergeant Merrick's place? Stayed silent, or spoken up when the moment demanded it? Do you think tradition still deserves a place in modern military service, or is it just expensive theatre, like the senator claimed? And was Merrick right to refuse that handshake, even knowing it could have ended his career? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you believe respect is earned through silence and service, hit that like button right now. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you don't miss what comes next. And share this story with someone who still thinks Royal Guards are just props for tourists, because after today, we both know better. Another investigation is already waiting for you on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow. Same time, same place, with another story from the men who guard history itself. Thanks for watching Guard Watch. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence.